So John is a designer and developer who spends most of his day fighting bad coding practices in the Rails view layer. He's a VP of design for PowerFleet. He's also run Meticulous, UX and design consultancy since '97. Prior to PowerFleet, he was the VP of design for CargoSense, and before that, a lead UI, UX, and front-end development internal apps at LivingSocial. In the past, he was also lead designer at InfoEther and ran Hyphenated People with Amy Hoy. He is currently running a small permaculture farm, interesting, outside of Charlottesville, where he can garden and play in the dirt with his wife and 4 children. He spent the last few months building a greenhouse from scratch, so people should ask about that. In his free time, which is the most interesting part of this entire thing, he plays guitar and keyboards for the DC-based band Juniper Lane, and he works on his solo music project Rotoscope. He's co-authored The Rails View with Bruce Williams, and he holds a master's in architecture from the Catholic University of America. So without further ado, John will be talking about UX for developers. I will be here moderating. My name is Scott Locke. I'm one of the moderators. If you have questions, please, there's a live event Q&A section that you will see in Teams or in whatever viewer you are watching this event in. Feel free to ask questions there. They'll be moderated and I'll publish them. And John, do you prefer questions during your presentation or after?
If it's relevant, feel free to fire it as we go. I just probably will not be able to see it the way that Teams and Keynote interact.
So if I see something that seems appropriate and contextually right, I will go ahead and ask it. We're also in Discord. If you haven't been with us all day, we are running a Discord server for Code Camp, and there is a channel in the Code Camp for this track called track-etc. So feel free to drop questions in there. After the session, I'll be monitoring the Q&A. If you do have a question, please try to keep it in the Q&A so we can see it. All right, with that, I will, if you go ahead and start sharing your content, I will stop sharing, and John, you can get started.
All right, let's see if this works. And
so I'm going to give you, I'm moving that content into a different view and almost clicked on end. That would have been devastating. I will click on send live. And so now you and your content are now presenting.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks to the Nova Code Camp team for having me here today. We're going to do a big overview on UX for developers. This is kind of a consolidation of a 2-day class that I do in person or in recent times virtually over Zoom with various teams. So there's a lot of things that we're not going to deep dive on. So if there's certain things that interest you, feel free to throw it in the Q&A, and if we have extra time, we can chase down those rabbit holes. I'm going to skip over some of this because I already got a pretty extensive introduction, so I don't need to go through that. So let's just go ahead and get started. When we start talking about UX, there's a lot of confusion. The word is thrown around. Sometimes people use it to mean interface. Sometimes people mean overall experience. Sometimes they talk about experience outside of our software. So we're going to break these things down, look at what the UX is, how it fits into our workflow, and how we can affect it, not only in doing design and concepting, but also how our code changes the UX of the product. And one thing I want you all to remember, if this is the only thing you get from this talk, UX debt is technical debt. We'll circle away. This comes back in about halfway through the talk, but this is the most important thing to think about, because so often it gets put in another column and all of a sudden the design team was working on something, but we never got to it because it wasn't technical debt. This needs to be talked about in the same way we talk about refactoring of our software. So let's get some definitions out of the way up first. If we don't have a shared language, it's difficult to collaborate, it's difficult to communicate, and let's get these terms clarified. You're going to hear all of these acronyms thrown around: UX, IA, CX, ID, XD. And really, when we start building this out and figuring out what these words mean, we start thinking about a lot of translation issues, user experience, information architecture, customer experience, interaction design, experience design. There are all these different phrases for the exact same thing. Some of them have a little more specification, and some imply certain kinds of artifacts that are coming out. But at the end of the day, they're all disciplines of a larger focus, and that's where we want to live. And that focus is simply the product experience. You can slice it and dice it if it's about using an app, or it's using a tool, or if it's you're walking through a building, or you're trying to get through to a live human on the phone by yelling operator over and over and over again until you trip the automated system into giving up and getting you to a person because it was poorly designed. That's a bad experience, right? So when we think about the disciplines of what we call broadly UX, there's a lot of stuff going on here. You'll notice that software development is one of these disciplines, even computer science, software development down here in the bottom. But all of this stuff goes together. And so very often when you're building UX teams, you're going to have people that work in a couple of these areas very deeply, and then have a very broad experience in other things. One phrase I've heard is a T-based designer, so they've got a broad experience in a couple deep dives, and sometimes it's more than one descender. But a lot of these disciplines are things we don't even think about in software: mechanical engineering, electrical engineering. And we're going into hardware, right? Architecture, spatial experience. Some of the stuff when I interact with my phone, I am rarely sitting in a white room with nothing else happening. So what is around me? How does that affect my experience? These are all things we have to start thinking about. Job titles are not helping us. So as of 2018, this was kind of the mishmash of job titles you would see. Now you have a lot of people pushing the UX engineer or front end. There's like this weird kind of like new combo one that's supposed to be the unicorn one. But this is the kind of stuff that we think about, and we see here across the bottom our list of all the different kind of silos that we would think about. Research being the one that is most often something that is it's very the lean startup, right? We got to go out and do the research first. The synthesis, the ideation, the prototyping and design, that's always kind of been held off. The developers tend to get a handover from a design team or a product manager or something like that, and then we implement. So what is UX and why should you care? So the what, let's define how Jacob Nielsen talks about this. Jacob Nielsen, if you haven't heard his name before, is one of the most well-known user experience and human factors people. Nielsen Norman Group with his partner, Don Norman, who's another well-known writer. They've kind of been around since the 70s. So they have a lot of experience talking about these things. They are also the most conservative, not political, but conservative in the sense of like, you shouldn't use that tech yet, or you should make sure that that's better accepted before using that when they talk about how to do software development. So there's 5 factors: the promptness with which users can learn something, the efficiency they attain while making use of it, how easy it is for them to remember how to use it, how error prone it can be, and the level of satisfaction they attain from using it. So these 5 factors, when we start talking about how is our UX, you could, make these 5 columns up on a board and start giving yourself a score of 1 to 10 on each one, see how you do. Some of these also require third-party research or somebody who's going to research something like, what is a user satisfaction? They're going to, they know you built that product, they're going to say, it's great, I love it, it's wonderful. And in their back of their mind, they'll be like, yeah, it could be better, but I don't want to upset that person. This is my friend, or, there's a right answer, right? I got to give them the right answer. So if you can rank well in all 5 of these, you're doing much better than most. And there's always room for improvement, but I think, you'll run out of easy wins in some of these categories pretty quickly. The next kind of category we're going to talk about here is design thinking. Design thinking is something that you'll hear a lot of design teams throw around, product teams throw around. Harvard Business Review abuses this phrase to a fault. But this came out of IDEO, which was a product company. And design thinking, as the CEO defined it, is innovation powered by direct observation of what people want and need in their lives. Then also you look at how they like or dislike the way particular products are made, and then you start looking about the whole ecosystem of the product, its packaging, its marketing, how it's sold, what the support life cycle is like. All this stuff factors in, right? It's not just the interface. And it uses, as a designer, we're talking about bringing in our sensibility and methods to match the needs with what we can actually do technologically. So we got to be able to think about both elements here. I'm sure you guys have probably seen some kind of deliverable come your way that is beautiful and a nightmare from an implementation perspective. So there's, how can we get to market? Yeah, sure, that's a 3-year project you just handed me as a design spec. Great. We can do it, but it's 3 years. So things to think about. Like this, there's a balance with all this stuff and how it all fits in. It's not just an interface design. For those, most people now know about Lean, but just as an overview, Lean came out and it became came out of the Toyota production system, and that became Lean manufacturing in the U.S. And Taiichi Ono is the founder of this, and he basically kind of took a bunch of concepts and looked at waste and queuing, standing in line, things waiting in a queue to be used or be implemented, and looking at work and waste combined together. It's, the more waste you have, the less work you're getting done when you have, here's your capacity limit. So this is where he started targeting. He went after things like the waste. So how much time do you, in our world, how much time do you spend managing Jira or managing your queue of issues in GitHub or wherever you may be managing it? How many times are you waiting on someone else to deliver something? That's going to cause waste, right? So that's the kind of things that we as developers want to look at and fix. But his efforts in Toyota led to an 8.3 times profit margin of the industry average in the early 2000s for Toyota, the car company. So that's something that, that is dollars, that is money in the bank, pulling out that stuff and making your company and your team more efficient. That's the best thing we can do here, right? And so this all goes hand in hand with the way we're working with developers, designers, all that. So lean thinking, this is kind of where we're starting to pull these things into the American lexicon from Japan. So precisely specifying what customers value, identifying the value streams, making that flow without interruption, and letting the customer pull as opposed to getting it pushed upon them. And all these ideas keep going. Now, this has kind of become what we all know and love as the lean startup, right? Build, measure, learn. But we took a look at all these things right now and we start talking about they all fit together. So we have design thinking starting off and we're going, we've got a four square here, right? So we've got the customer problem on the left, customer solution on the right, concrete and abstract on as the vertical axis. So we're defining, we're observing people and doing research, we're framing opportunities, we're coming up with insights, and then we're going to brainstorm some ideas, and then we say, let's try something. And now we start build, measure, learn, right? But in each build, we're doing iterative development, and there's our agile, right? So all this stuff fits together. This isn't something where there's a clear handoff. There's a lot of collaboration. And obviously, we also have the famous, this isn't working, we got to pivot out. But that's the thing. So all this stuff mixed together gives us Lean UX. And Jeff Gothelf is the author of Lean UX. It's not a thick book. It's pretty easy to get through. A lot of great ideas in there. But Lean UX is the practice of bringing the true nature of product to life faster in a collaborative, cross-functional way. So less documentation, building a shared understanding, getting it out the door. So the why, again, UX debt is technical debt, straight out of the gate. If you're not working on it, you're building up a backlog. And that's going to hurt your app or your tool at some point, and then it's going to take longer to go back and fix all that because you continue to build upon a weak foundation. And likewise, this is not just about something looking good. There's a lot of very good looking apps that are horrible to use. I think the best case is the dribblization of design. I believe, I can't remember, it was Jesse James Garrett, coined that. Basically, if you go to Dribbble, which is a designer sharing site, almost everybody has designed a weather app. They're all awful. They are not usable. They're all very pretty. They all look really nice. None of them answer the two questions my wife asks me almost every morning. What's the weather? What's the high and the low today? And is it going to rain? The one app that seems to do this is not really flashy, and that is Dark Sky, which just got bought by Apple maybe a month ago. But you pull up that screen and the first thing you see is very clear. Here's the next hour. Here's today. Here's the high and the low. And so you'll see if rain is forecast. If there's going to be rain in the next hour, it kind of tells you how heavy it's going to be. That's the question that most people are asking when they're looking at their weather app. And a lot of the designs are these beautiful things of, oh, it's got this sunset when it's, this kind of like nice sunny weather and this time of year. And it's like, that's not the problem. You're solving the wrong problem. So as we start looking at this, experience is everybody's problem. This is not something that needs to live in the design team. This is team-wide, company-wide. This is not just even the build team, right? Software build is where I'm going to include the project management office, the product team, the engineers, DevOps, designers, design ops. All that is kind of the build team, quote unquote. This extends out. We start looking at customer service reps, people that are taking phone calls and dealing with your customers. If you have retail, that is part of the experience. This is all needs to be thought about. So with that said, design's not an isolated discipline. It's not magical and mystical, as much as some designer may say, I have to go to the mountain and come back with this wonderful thing to share with you. It's a process. And let me introduce you to a gentleman named Ed Catmull, if you're not familiar. Ed Catmull is the recently retired head and one of the founders of Pixar. He and John Lasseter and a few others, Alvy Ray Smith being one of the better known ones in there as well, founded Pixar, and he is a computer scientist. He is probably most of the things that you don't even realize your graphic card is doing, he wrote a lot of the code for. So it's one of those people that you don't even realize how much we use on a daily basis of his technology. But the other thing to think about is that he and his team at Pixar are probably to blame in a good way for teaching Steve Jobs how to manage creativity. And that coming back into Apple has kind of changed Apple from a nearly failed company to one of the most valuable companies in the world, that mentality. So a couple of quotes from this great book that is called Creativity, Inc. If there's more truth in hallways than in meetings, you have a problem. You'll see this often, especially when you have cult of personality issues in a company. You have strong people that will kind of react poorly to suggestions. You'll get a lot more people murmuring in the hallways, but they won't speak up at a meeting. That is a cancer, and you have to find out how to fix that. And it's really a culture problem that is affecting products, right? Another one, and this is one that really started. This book is maybe a decade old, but this is really starting to get into some stuff that I feel is really relevant for today. If there's people in your organization who feel they're not free to suggest ideas, you lose. So we're not just talking about people that are on your team that may be disrespected. Like, you should be able to get an idea from the janitor, and that should be a valuable idea. That should be valuable insight. You should be able to take this to, anybody from the front desk worker to the president of the company, and everybody is going to have different takes on things. Being able to collect those and channel them and synthesize them is when we're going to start to find some interesting solutions. Also, our job as managers is to create environments, and it's to protect new ideas. So often, there's a lot of stuff, especially when you have an experienced team. This ties into the last slide, an experienced team, and there's somebody who's new, and they say, well, what if? And everybody in the team may have been through that. And they're just like, yeah. And that dismissiveness, well, it's like, we've been through this conversation 17 times. That shuts people down. And that person may have a lot of other great ideas. So there's a couple ways we can do to work this, right? Is basically, we have to go through these broken periods. We have to go through rabbit holes and experimentation in our product where we end up with stuff where we're like, oh, that was not good. But if we don't do it and we're not in a place where it's safe to do that, we're not going to get to the great product. Some of the things you can do in meetings is requiring people to say yes and. So there's no, especially when brainstorming meetings, when you're first coming up with concepts, when you're working on sketching ideas on of like what a screen could be on a whiteboard, nothing can be dismissive or disruptive in the sense of saying, no, that's bad. It really changes the energy of a meeting. So it's pretty fascinating. Another thing to think about from your corporate level, your company needs to compete, right? Far too often, we are thinking about people in our same or competitors in our cohort. So if we are a new startup, we are thinking about cohort down here, like smaller companies. Maybe we're not as large. Maybe we're only 15 people. So we're not thinking about the 800-pound gorilla in the room. However, our customers are. So one example is that when I say you need to compete, you're thinking about if you were in banking, who's the best bank? Who's got the best stuff out there? If you are in construction, who's the best thing out there? Now this goes cross category as well. For example, when I did a bunch of work for Procore, none of the designs you see here, look, the app looks nothing like this now. This is like 5 years ago, and they didn't have a team, and we built out a team. But the initial pitch, we were sitting there saying, okay, it's like, how do I compare to other industries? You have people coming in to use this financial software that manages construction. How do I compare to QuickBooks? How do I compare to these other platforms that people are used to? Because there's a mental idea of, well, QuickBooks is here. This feels like it's here, therefore it's not as good. Doesn't matter if the functionality is all there. This is all about the experience, right? So we took a whole bunch of ideas. We've been working on change orders. So in a construction project, change orders are the nemesis of everybody. It means that somehow it wasn't captured in the design, and there is a change to the project. It could be that the specification from the architect was bad. It could be that the customer changed their mind. So in this case, change due to owner request. It could be that the contractor made a mistake, and that means the contractor's got to pay for it. So things you got to look at like that. Their customer here was the person running the construction job. Does it delay my schedule? How much does it cost? Two biggest things. So we basically started pulling this stuff together and putting a screen together. And this is where you start talking about squint test. What's the most important things here? Bolton 2 bathroom upgrade, 0 days, $12,132. Owner request. Okay, those are we start pulling out the main pieces of content, making those pop more. This is the kind of thing where this is not fancy design stuff. This is like, let's talk about what's the most important pieces of content here. What this is the more traditional information architecture wireframing mentality that it's good to bring in. But we took this screen, put it in front of management. We had not built any of this, and basically said, this is what your app could look like. And through that conversation of how do you compare to QuickBooks, and this is where you could be, green light, what do you need? Pretty much is how. And so we built out a UX team, and I mean they were one of the first unicorns in the AEC space. So I mean they're still doing really well. They're out of Santa Barbara, and it's one of those cool moments. And again, the app looks nothing like this now. It's 5 years of evolution and design concepts later, and that's things keep moving forward. So what is our current state of the art? We have no direction sometimes. We'll have customers say, that we won't get any direction from our customer, from our management, things of that nature. Often we have no team. We're a bunch of engineers and we don't have a designer. We don't have design resources at all, not even like a researcher, somebody like that. It's literally us making it up. Or the team's overloaded. We have one person trying to do all the things. The team could be outsourced, where we say, don't go to the team because it costs us money every time. So everything that we need to go to understand gets outsourced. So we're stingy with our own resource there. An overloaded spec. Everything in the world is written in. You'll find, for those of you working on government projects that are not yet doing Agile, this is probably your life. Or an incomplete and out of date spec. Once that specification is written, everything, it's a snapshot, right? So if it's not kept up to date, it ages very quickly. So we have some fixes to these kind of common problems, right? So the first is pods, not Tide Pods, just pods. Cross-functional teams focus on solving a problem. You'll hear a lot of CEOs say things of, or just upper management, and it wouldn't be great if we just had our own Jony Ive. And this has gone away a little bit since he's no longer in the spotlight after leaving Apple. But even Jony Ive, Knight Commander of Order of the British Empire, all sorts of things like that. He started off as a student with awesome hair at Newcastle Polytechnic, right? This was not just like, he wasn't just born like Athena springing from the head of Zeus and suddenly doing design at Apple. He went through a great 80s mustache and half sip phase, and then you've got this 90s business Jony Ive here on the right. But he almost quit Apple at this point. He was basically, he said something to the effect of he was tired of decorating beige boxes. And obviously Jobs came back and they had one of the best collaborations, and he left in November of last year, leaving a massive legacy on the design world. If you think about all the things we interact with right now with our phones and our laptops, they are all pretty heavily derivative works of his industrial design. So this has become this magical guy, right? This guy solved everything. Well, he ran design for Apple. He wasn't the only designer at Apple. So because everyone's like, oh, I want a super senior design guru unicorn, and they can do UX, and then they can code the back end too, and they can do all the design work, and they can do all the front end work. And it's like, no, that doesn't work. And the people that even get remotely close to that tend to end up being designer founder types. They're not going to be a senior UX person at your company. That's not exciting to them. They're out there. They want to go work on some video work right now, or they want to go play with this or try that. It's touching everything in the stack. It's more interesting to find and build the team, because you're also then not with a bus number of one. So what is a pod? Pod is usually everything in the build team mixed together, focused on either a feature or a subset of the overall product. If you're doing service-based architecture, this works really well because you kind of line up the services with the pods. That's how we did it at LivingSocial, for example. So you got your project manager, your product manager. If you have a lot of motion, if you're doing a lot of mobile work, you may have a motion designer. You're going to have a couple engineers doing different work, prototyping. Maybe some are just focused on the prototype side. Maybe some are just focused on the back end or enterprise integration. You've got some UX research. You've got visual design. You've got QA. You've got your front end engineer. All these roles all sit together, all work together. They all report around this product and around this piece of the product. So instead of sitting out there and saying, let me go get this from this other team, they're all sitting together. They're all working in the same chat room. They're all in the same room in Slack, however it is you all work. You cut all the silos out and you have them collaborate as much as possible. One of the critical things to do here is research. First off is shadowing your users. Shadow whenever possible. Sometimes we arrive at the need for UX because the noise from the user base has finally gotten past the developer and support teams and to the ears of upper management or investors, God forbid. So this can be helpful when we need to start fighting the fires, but having a team that can be doing some research, or if we can do it ourselves, is even more helpful. So if we can do it, shadow the users. It doesn't have to be formal, but it's difficult to find the resources unless you make time for it. Case in point, with LivingSocial, we did a lot of customer support work when we were running the internal tools group. Sitting down, we got a feature set from the product team, but then we went and watched the people, and a lot of it was just simple things like they were doing double entry. They were doing all sorts of copying and pasting because they'd have to type it in Salesforce, and then they'd have to type it into the Rails app. And so they'd copy paste. And this slowed calls down massively. So we basically rebuilt that whole system, and it basically did all it put everything in the right place for them. They filled out one form, put it in the right places. It also removed a lot of the questions. They filled out the boxes. It said, here's the 2 things you can offer them, as opposed to giving them all this stuff. And it basically simplified customer support in a massively scaling organization to the point where we had numbers improve dramatically while bringing in new inexperienced people, which is a rarity. So that's the kind of stuff like that shadowing. If we hadn't done that shadowing, we would not have had a successful product. Another example of great shadowing. So 53,000 miles of market research, another Toyota engineer. Basically, the Sienna was not selling. So he went to North America to fix their minivan, right? The Toyota Sienna. It was basically being sold 2-to-1. So in 2000, he started driving around with the intent of that he would be applying all this stuff to the 2004 model year. And he drove the Sienna and his competitors' cars all over every state in the US and started discovering things that, if you only driven on the interstate, you would not find. So all sorts of examples here that are really great, and you start thinking of like, oh, hey, that this is really dog fooding it, right? Just stuff like, oh, okay, and maybe most users will never need some of these things, but it improves the experience overall because you're just, road noise in Alaska. Okay, well, improving road noise in Alaska is going to improve road noise for everyone, right? So these are the kind of things when we dog food it, that's awesome. Sometimes it's hard to do that and we just don't know it. And you can actually this is a lady out of San Francisco that I've worked with before, Kelly Goto, and she does amazing research where they actually are out there, they follow people around and film it. It's kind of creepy, it's kind of crazy, it's pretty awesome though. And so they can sit there and say like, okay, this person, how does the app fit into their daily life? How does it fit into this lifestyle? For those that can't afford that kind of budget, you can actually run just somebody. This is a thing called full story, and if you're not working in a compartmentalized or kind of like HIPAA or one of those worlds, this is something that you could probably use on your app. This will actually record clicks and screen interactions. And you can do it from the free model, which will do 1,000 things a month, I believe, up to, every single case is recorded. And now your product team and your UX team can sit and watch. Like when we have, hey, we have a lot of abandonment in this flow. What's going on? Let's look at this flow. Let's look at people in that flow and find out what's happening. It's a really powerful tool. So definitely play with this in the free model. But now you have all this research. What do we do with it, right? We've just got a mountain of information. How do we synthesize that and apply it? Some of the ways we can do that are mental models and empathy. So Indy Young is a famous UX researcher. She came out of Adaptive Path. She now mostly does speaking and presenting, but she's written 2 books for Rosenfeld, one being Mental Models, and the other came out last year called Practical Empathy. And they're in the same vein. Mental Models is a little more tactical than Practical Empathy, but it's about figuring out like all the little steps of something. And then we can start identifying where the software fits in. So I had the pleasure of working with her on a large project for a really big database company, and their mental model went down the hallway. It was printed out on like plotting paper, and it went down a whole hallway. It was really complex. But here's a simple one. This is a mental model of prototypical morning for somebody. Maybe not in COVID times, but this is definitely the drive to work kind of mental model of what seems to be so long ago, right? So getting dressed, awakening, eating, commuting, and now above the line, those are kind of like the concepts, the tasks. Below the line, we start talking about objects and items and things like that. And then we can start saying, hey, here's where we have reach, here's where we can fit. So this is a great organizational method, and you can do that on a board with sticky notes too. It doesn't have to be a formal artifact like that. Journey maps, this is more of a formal artifact, but again, they help everyone on the team understand the flow. So here's a couple great examples. This is a journey map of diabetes. So you see at the top, we've got life before diabetes, the initiative, visiting a provider, and then living with it. Like, okay, I've got some ways this can go, right? If it's type 2, is it something that I can nominally cure by lifestyle changes, or if it's something that's going to be a permanent thing, how do I, where do I end up on this graph at the end? And if I don't adhere to it, we can see kind of like the charting out. But lots of information in here, and this is stuff where we can start talking about where are our touch points as a developer if I'm working on an app for this, so what happens when the patient visits a healthcare professional? What are some of the problems? What are some of these green boxes, by the way, are hard to see right now, but these are quotes from research subjects about life at that moment. So these are just helping everyone understand the overall project, the overall product, and the overall issue that we're trying to solve. This is one of an Uber customer, so using an Uber. Dramatically different design, but here, you've got interactions here down at the bottom, the touch point analysis, the mobile app versus the Uber website versus the driver, versus say Facebook or something like that. Lot of information in here too. This is one for visiting the Smithsonian, the museum grouping in DC around the National Mall. So all sorts of stuff here. Notice the in-museum galleries and halls is a very small part of this. But we've got a lot of touch points. We've got our mobile device. So what kind of apps are we building here that help with navigation of the Smithsonian, understanding what you're looking at, but then also before digital planning, people, purchasing tickets to go and come to DC and visit DC. And how do I know which things I can go to? How long does it take me to go through the Smithsonian? What are the best days? Things of that nature. So this is a really great example of like a kind of a customer journey. I also encourage teams to break down and make proto personas. These are high level personas. This is not the kind of work we're talking about. This is the artifact from an agency. We want something far faster. And with that, we take an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and a Sharpie, and we get something done really quick. And I'm talking like XKCD quality is the best you can do. You can't do something nicer. Stick figures are awesome. That's all you need. We're not trying to get all deep down in the weeds of this. We want to have some high level personas and start talking about how does this person interact with our product. And this is another place where you can rapidly start finding holes where we didn't think about this. Or if somebody tells you, hey, as this kind of individual, I feel that your app doesn't serve me because of X, Y, and Z. Good opportunity to make a proto persona and start talking about how the app can better serve that individual. Something to think about. Hypotheses. This is for the BDD types. This is going to feel very, very, very familiar, right? Agile stories. As a user type, or given whatever, I want some goals for that reason. Breaking that down into the very specific Gherkin style that was spoken about earlier this morning in our track. That's the same kind of vibe. But Lean UX, let's twist it up a little bit. So we believe that we will achieve a business outcome if a persona type can achieve a user outcome with this feature. So this is really a much higher level. We're not getting down into the tactical of the BDD, but we can lean to that. But this is when we can start saying, with this, if we do this test and build out this prototype, do we get the outcome we want? And if we don't, then we come back to the drawing board and try something else. But it's not, this is really where we're going to put all these in a table, start ranking them, say, I think this is going to have the biggest impact. Excuse me, build it, prototype here, like not a final ship to customer. Build the prototype, test it. What do we learn back? Getting out of the mentality of everything has to be in the computer. A lot of the problems and the slowdown in the early phases of UX work are from I don't know the software. So literally, these are the tools you are allowed to use: Sharpies, pens, pencils, papers, Post-it notes. Pretty much everybody can scribble boxes and arrows, and that's really where we start. And your phone is basically, this is your camera, right? You draw something on the board, click, there you go. That's it. That's your documentation. Attach it to a ticket if you really want to. But that's really this is about the synthesis of ideas and getting stuff done rapidly. And this should not be a meeting where one person's at the board. This is one of these things where everyone's up, everyone's on their feet, everyone's got a pen and is scribbling ideas. Working remote, I will often do things on a roll of architectural trace. Like I went to architecture school, so this for me is just habit, decades of habit at this point. But what's great about it is you can overlay it. So here you're seeing I've overlaid a sheet on top of the first sketch I did. And, this is, again, boxes and arrows and squiggly lines and some text. Ryan Singer, who has been Basecamp's designer for almost 2 decades now, is he popularized this kind of scribbly, you're not writing out a lot of text, you're really scribbling, you're making notes. It's really just to get the form of something down and see how it feels. So there's that. And then you can also use this for flows, right? Here's just a login flow. And then, at the top, very simple. It's just, did I check all these boxes? Did it go in the right place? Okay, cool. And then, okay, let me do my create. I'm going to do a create method. So I'm going to choose a new type of project, and that's going to kick me into a specific form builder. And then I'm going to have a success. Okay, what is that? Now let's break that down, because there's a lot of complexity rolled up in those 4 boxes, right? So this is stuff to talk about, scribble it down quickly, don't get too deep. And a lot of stuff we did at LivingSocial was this way. We would go and sketch micro interactions, is what a lot of people refer to them as. So this was looking at something with just like how our cities did email sends. So each city in LivingSocial was its own kind of entity that had its own scheduling. So if you were a member of the Atlanta LivingSocial, they had 5 or 6 categories, and you would only get offers relevant to that because it was all about local. There were a couple things where they'd kick out national offers across the chain, but most of it was about managing localities and what happened with that. So really, this is something we just came and sketched this in 15 minutes, and then I went out and started doing the high fidelity mock of it while the developer was building on the Rails side. to support it. So we didn't have to spend a lot of times like, let's come up with a formal thing. We did a really quick thing. We started working on it, came together again, ship really quick. Excuse me 1 minute. Story maps. Again, this is kind of taking some of those cards from before, just grouping them, things like that. This kind of is like a weird mix of mental models and some other stuff. Storyboards. This is kind of walking through a flow. Where you start saying, okay, boom, 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 boom. And then you can start breaking these out into different features and doing detail. One of my favorites is called 6-ups or sketchboards is what some people call them. So you basically fold a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper and start sketching, and it can be variations on a screen, or it can be a flow. Typically we'll do this for a flow, and then you present it and everybody does it again. You present it and everybody does it a third time. And the whole team will start to coalesce towards an idea. It's really kind of magical to watch. It's a lot of fun. Crazy Eights is another similar one. This is more about rapid prototyping of a single idea where you're trying to come up with 8 different approaches in 8 minutes or so. Vision boards, like I showed from the one from Procore before, this is what we did with LivingSocial. These are 2 ideas we built in Photoshop before we had any approval to do any development work. And we put 5 of these in front of Aaron Battalion, who was the CTO. And Aaron is not short for words, and he was just like, he just is not saying anything, which is the most frightening thing for a designer. With no feedback is like, what's going on? And he basically, this is like 18 months of work. We're like, yeah, we're just trying to say, here's where we could go. And we ended up not going in this direction on some of these, but a lot of the elements did make it through. Likewise, this is another vision board. You know, they're very high level. And the design can change dramatically. It's hard to do this not in person, but PINUPS is basically where everybody gets up and literally tacks things into a wall. And this is from architecture, really. But bring in people that are outside of design, bring in people that are outside of development, and that are going to ask the question that everyone is like, oh, I shouldn't ask that because I should know it. Get those people that are just business people or just an app user and walk them through something, and then they're going to ask you questions and build on that. Clickable prototypes. There's so many tools these days to do these that it makes it so easy to test stuff long before we're getting down into Swift or into Java or anything like that. So, you know, something like this, you can do a mock-up and say, here's how we work. Here's how this little piece should work. Here's a handoff. And then I take it to a prototyping tool. And any of those, you know, some people prototype in Keynote, InVision, Figma, XD, Marvel, all these different tools help with testing. Sketch now has a Sketch mobile thing where you can have the design on your screen and interact with it on a phone that you're holding next to it. A lot of great options out there, and every week there seems to be a new tool that's coming out that somebody's pitching. So this comes down to that the deliverables should really help drive the decisions and not just document them. And so we start doing testing, right? How do we test? There used to be a great app, and unfortunately it was retired in 2019, called Silverback. Silverback, for those who aren't familiar, this is a video from LivingSocial, and we are testing here a prototype that we built in, I don't even remember the framework anymore, but this is all talking to JSON files. There is nothing real about this. It's real HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but it's just talking to JSON. So we basically had the head of scheduling going through and working with the app, and you can see it tracks her mouse clicks. And so she's a very nervous clicker. She's just clicking on all sorts of stuff and seeing what happens. And this was great because the product person tested this on her computer at her desk where she was comfortable, and then brought that back for the team to watch. And so there weren't 10 people hovering around her saying, what about this? What about that? So you can do this with a lot of other tools. ScreenFlow on the Mac or Camtasia on the PC kind of gets you close these days. Full Story can kind of do the same thing. There's a new product that used to be usertest.io. It's now called UserPeak that's under development that apparently does this same thing as well. You can also do things where you actually send it out. Usertesting.com is one of those platforms. And you send it out and basically random people try it like they're trying out your app. UserPeak is supposed to be similar to that with a little more control. And worst case, take your computer over to somebody and say, hey, what do you make of this? What would you do here? How would you do that? The questions have got to be wide open. You really don't want to say, if you click on this, like it's so hard too, because as a designer developer watching a test, you're like, the button, click, No, you can't do that. You got to just wait and let them go through it. And that if they don't see that button, they don't understand it, take it back to the drawing board. So how many tests? And this is going to push some buttons, because this has become a real, this research has become kind of controversial. This was from Jacob Nielsen in 1993, and they did a how many UX tests it would take to discover an issue. It's not a linear relationship, but it rose really rapidly, and then after a while, each additional user test would identify fewer new issues. So he figured, based on their research, that they would find 85% of the issues with only 5 users. So that's 1 day of user testing instead of days and days of user testing. There's that cohort right there, right? So his argument from that paper and future articles that he's written on it is that it's return on investment. Yes, you would find a lot of other issues if you kept going. That's not being discounted. However, you got 85%. Go fix them. Come back. Do it again. So you're going to get more, because it can be really expensive to do in-person user testing in a lab. That's a really expensive proposition. Like I said, not so fast. If we're talking user segments, Experience Dynamics did a great post on this last year in March. With 5 users or less, and if you got to do like 3 iterations or 3 rounds of testing. If you have multiple user segments, you need to multiply that per user segment. So now you start to get bigger and bigger. So for prototypes, we're talking probably 8 to 10 people. Finished products, we're now in the 15 to 20 range, depending on your user segments, right? So the small sample sizes can hurt for 4 factors. Recruiting issues, the more people you recruit, the more likely you are to get a diverse feedback. Moderation effects, so the person administering the test can skew it. Observation, like watching the test, did we as designers and developers not recognize a problem? And then low insight users, that user, the person that we happened to pick for this just didn't give us a lot of value in finding problems. And even Nielsen himself had said that 5 is not always the optimum number, right? So for quantitative studies, they want at least 20. Card sorting, which is a technique we're not going to talk about today, but it's kind of like allocating like objects together is 15, and eye tracking is almost 40. So at least 5, ideally 15 to 20. Real quick, we'll look at design systems. So a lot of design systems now is creating a single version source of design truth. And this evolved out of style guides. So this was the LivingSocial internal tools style guide that basically we packaged as a Ruby gem. Anybody would install it with a couple commands, and suddenly they basically had access to all these elements. They also had documentation with the Rails engine built in development mode. And that we basically took Bootstrap, we took the elements we liked, built it out in SCSS. This is 2012, 2013, right? This is a long time ago. And then everybody could do their stuff. And this looks very familiar to people that use Bootstrap, but we started making some stuff a little more playful based on different projects, buttons that would work across the board for us, with very specific styles and sizes. And most of these we didn't use. Mostly we were using the ones here at the bottom. And this is that customer service app I talked about before. Became a dual screen setup where you would load up a customer and it would suddenly have their cases on the left, their purchase history on the right. And all this stuff was a massive flow where the two, early kind of pre-action cable the screens talking to each other with Backbone.js. That was the framework. Vintage, real vintage. And here's, this is another version of that scheduling prototype, right? So here's a later version of that's in that same vein. And here's something, this was actually a skinned version of Salesforce. They went in and wrote Apex and did the design on top of Salesforce to get all the internal tools feeling the same. So there's a design systems repo. If you want to kind of see like where people have started taking design systems, a lot of things are really complex, and they're becoming more, depending on your framework, they're becoming more and more componentized based off kind of like the atomic design story from Brad Frost, or if you're using React, something like Storybook.js, where you actually now have, this is your design system, right? All these little elements in Storybook. So we've gone all over the map today. Focus. How do we get this stuff done? This is a great book by Jake Knapp, one of the Google Venture guys, and they basically kind of threw this stuff together. He and Daniel Burka talk a lot about it. We've talked about the designer mentality of going to the mountain, right? Solving problems in isolation is hard, But when we can get a great team together and different insights, it's going to be a lot easier to come up with something. So here's your weekly schedule based off their kind of thing. Pick a target, sketch it out on Tuesday, decide on Wednesday, build a prototype. So these prototypes are not super high fidelity. Test it on Friday. Boom, boom, boom. Kick this out. 4 runs a month for each team. You'll get a lot of information really quick. Maybe you do this once a month on whenever you're starting something, right? Some other stuff that you can focus on today. Love the first time user. So often you load up a screen and it's blank because we design screens like this. We design finished dashboards that are months into a project. What happens when I log in the first time? Well, maybe I help people out. Maybe I give them a little video. Maybe I give them a wizard to set things up. I hint that there will be content here on the right-hand side. Some options like that. Some other stuff, making sure that people know where they are. So often they, especially with users that are less computer savvy, they will feel afraid because they'll get lost. I don't know where I'm going to go. Don't break the back button with JavaScript. It's gotten a lot better, but it used to be a big problem. And always, I should be able to always click the logo and get out, get back to where I started. What am I supposed to do here? Clarity of flow. If you have to put a label on it, you're doing it wrong. So many ideas, so many examples from architecture that I could do a whole talk on just examples from architecture of bad UX, but push should be a horizontal bar, pull is a handle, right? That's kind of, those are more intuitive, right? So, but if I have to write push on a label and stick it above a handle on a door, I have failed as a designer. Google's famous for saying don't be evil, although we can have an argument over if they're keeping up with that. This is probably the most evil thing most of us could remember. It looks like you're trying to do something. You're trying to do this. Hey, 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 it interrupts. It interrupts my flow. It interrupts my mental model. No, bad. Likewise, modern. Get 3 months of premium access for free. Okay, why did you take over a quarter of my screen with a modal? Bad. This is bad. I love this. Is a hilarious site. Modals with a Z.com. They have a lot of good ideas and a lot of good rules of thumb for using modals, but in general, things like that. Talking about download time, if you're on a Mac, you can go get the developer tools and go look for additional tools for Xcode and pull down the network link conditioner. You can do, there's a net limiter for Windows, I'll show on the next screen, is a similar thing, but you basically can set 3G, DSL, LTE, Edge. One of the names of the settings of default settings is quote very bad network. So you can also do this on iOS too, which is really where we see the network issues happen more so than on the desktop these days. But being able to say, hey, this works great on my gigabit fiber connection, but it works awfully on this DSL when I simulate the DSL at a 40 down. Okay, let's figure out what's going on. Net limiter, like I said, on the Windows side, you can kind of do the same thing. And this is great. Like, get into the shoes of your customer. Figure out, like, did I really need to send down that much of JavaScript libraries? Where can I cut out my download time? How can I get to a first paint faster? And if I can't just get to a first paint faster, how can I hint that something is happening? Medium, Discord, a bunch of sites do this now. Facebook too, kind of hinting that there's content that'll be there in a minute. It's better than a spinner. There's lots of other options. You can be a little more playful with it too. That's it. One thing I want to kind of wrap up with, design is typography. A lot of times people think design is all these fancy graphics and things like that. And 90% of design is type. This is Helvetica. This phrase, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, is used all the time because it has every lowercase letter from a font. But let's go ahead and tweak this a little bit. Comic Sans, that changed the feel dramatically. All I did was change the font. Or how about this? Slightly distressed font in all caps, and it's bold. Okay, now we're changing, we're in 2 lines, we're changing the vibe. Just made each word a line. Totally different vibe. 1 color, only type. Haven't done any graphics yet, right? Changed the font size, did not change what we call the line height, the leading in print. Now this is really a graphical element as opposed to that. Let's take it and mix it up a little bit. Let's do 2 different fonts. We got Gotham and we've got Chronicle here. So, we're starting to get like, this is more like a headline design you see in a magazine. Let's throw 1 color in. Dramatically different. My eye starts jumping in different ways. I read Quick Brown Fox first, right? Compared to that. Back to that. Also, something as simple as the spacing, the line height really can affect readability. So if you have something that feels clunky or it's hard to read, or try just adjusting your line height. And this stuff feels magic, but it's not. This is one of, if you haven't seen this meme, it's hilarious and it's great because it really is true. That's that your eye follows this. This is type hierarchy. This is standard graphic design stuff. These are not tricks, and learning them lets you design better products. If you really want to go down the type rabbit hole, these 3 books are a great place to start. And so for my parting shots, my admonishments here, let's the famous St. Exupéry quote: "We know we've achieved perfection when we've got nothing left to take away." And from the Marvel Style Guide, design is just problem solving within a set of constraints. We do that in software too, right? So it rarely has anything to do with graphics. If you are doing a lot of UX work, or you want to do a lot of UX work, this is kind of a great little handbook. This is from Rosenfeld Media by Leah Bewley, who's now I think the education head of Envision, prototype app. But this goes through all the different kind of tools and techniques you can use, and it talks about it, when it's useful, how to do it. So it's a great little arsenal reference, like of what can I do here? What are some things I can employ to solve this problem? And most of them, again, involve paper and Post-it notes. If this is interesting to you, I've been taking the course I do in person and building it into a video class, and that's at developerux.com. If you sign up there, it should be launching in the next week or two. Just starting to film it now. So if you have any questions, we have a few minutes left here. We started a few minutes late, so I'm not sure if we're trying to get back on schedule. I will be in the Discord for the rest of the day and probably on, or you can send me an email, hit me up on Twitter. And if you have any questions, go ahead and take a look.
Thank you, John, so much for the presentation. We are about out of time. If you have questions, please post them in the Q&A in the next few 30 seconds or so. If not, John, are you going to be able to jump over to the track, etc.?
Yeah, I'm already in that channel, so just if you can just add me, I'll be able to respond.
Okay, yeah. So if you have any questions for John, please jump on over to the Discord server, and we will get started here in a minute with RC Carter talking about election guard. So thank you very much, John.
Thank you all.